Well, yes, school is back in session. Summer is beginning to wind down. It's awesome that it actually feels today like summer might be actually winding down, although it's coming back. It's not over. But next week is the unofficial and traditional end of summer with the Labor Day weekend. So it's close. Here we make a point of remembering Labor Day, remembering all those who's labored with their hands and their sore backs, remembering the labor unions and those who lived and fought and died so that we could take Labor Day and have weekends free. And I'm getting ahead of myself. That's next week. We're definitely going to talk about that. But today we are talking about the weekend. We're looking at the origin of even having the idea of a weekend. Because the point of conflict in our story really is what is the purpose of Sabbath, what it means to take a day of rest. And we have come to live by these patterns of having 6 days of work of some kind followed by at least 1 day of rest. And this pattern is woven into the fabric of our scriptures. The very first story of the Hebrew and Christian scriptures is that story of creation that concludes with the seventh day. The first seventh day, having created everything, God rests and blesses a day and calls it holy. And then gradually the laws of Moses, which were given to the Israelites after their escape from Egypt, their exodus, reminds the people again to observe Sabbath. Exodus 20 says, 6 days you will labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God, and you shall not do any work, you or your sons or your daughters or your male or female slaves or your livestock or the alien residents in your towns. For 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and the sea and all that is in them and rested on the seventh, and the Lord has blessed Sabbath. Deuteronomy adds another motivation to this command. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to keep the Sabbath. Now, the Israelites were in Egypt, and they were slaves, and they had been forced to work whenever their masters commanded, and most cases they did not get a day off. So when they first received this command to stop working, to set aside just 1 day to rest their bodies, along with families and servants and livestock, they were given permission to take some time for renewal, for prayer. This was experienced as grace, as something that brought joy. It was a gift of God for the purpose of making room for some health, healing, growth, life, love. But time passed, and what began as a gift became a burden, with too many rules and regulations attached to it. Too many, this is what you can't do, and this is what work means, and this was what isn't work, and the line became longer and longer. So we pick up with the story where Jesus is teaching in a synagogue, and he notices a woman who is unable to stand up straight, and he calls her over, lays his hands on her, tells her she can now be free. And when he does, she stands, and she is elated, and she praises and thanks God. He has brought health and hope on that day, and you would think everyone there would have been jumping for joy. But no, the religious leaders who were already suspicious of him became angry and annoyed. This was the Sabbath, and healing was work, and work was forbidden. So they squelched this wonderful mood. They told the crowd not to ask for any more healing. There are 6 days in which work can be done. Just go home and come back on those days. This is the law, and the law should be obeyed. It seemed that that's what they believed was most important to God, to be law-abiding citizens. They were sure that God expected obedience to the letter of the law, and that was their job to make sure that happened. Living their lives so tightly focused on this belief, they had lost track of the true purpose of Sabbath. They had forgotten that a day off from work, a day of rest, was a gift that was meant to bring joy. Its purpose was for healing, if only the very basic healing that rest brings. Now, in the Jewish tradition, Sunday is the first day of the week, which makes Saturday the Sabbath, and it actually would begin on Friday night and still does at sundown on Friday into Saturday. And in the earliest days of the church, the early Christians still maintained their Jewish identity, and they would observe the Sabbath on Saturday. But then Sunday was a special day for the followers of Jesus. It was a reminder of Easter every week, that day when the disciples first encountered the risen Christ. So it became a day to gather and eat and celebrate and rest as well. Which day of the week you take off is not as important as remembering the purpose. We are commanded and invited and offered the opportunity to take time to rest, to relax, to renew our bodies and our minds and our spirits. Taking that time that we need to experience and express gratitude for the gift of life. Taking Sabbath time is important, and it seems like it gets harder to do all the time because there's no getting away from the beep. My phone's in the office. I don't bring it in here because it's back there beeping, and yours is probably buzzing. It's harder and harder to step away from work. But it is important because it helps us to order our lives in a way that experiences peace. These instructions to keep Sabbath matter because they create room for each person to rest, to flourish, to nurture health and happiness. The Sabbath matters because it encourages us, even requires us, to not just for ourselves and our needs rest, to make sure that others have the opportunity to do that as well. It exists so that we might take time to love and care for one another. But God is not stuck on which day that you rest. This truth became real to me when I was a student, at seminary, and I worked at the Home of the Innocents. The Home of the Innocents was a temporary shelter for children who had been taken from their homes, not because they had done anything wrong, but because they had been neglected or abused. They were there until the courts could work out a relative who they could live with or get them into foster care. Now, people were a little more maybe legalistic back then, and I was a seminary student. But as I thought about asking my supervisor at the children's home not to put me on the schedule for Sunday, well, it just didn't seem to make sense. Because 2-year-old Darren, with cigarette burns dotted across his thighs, was not going to feed and bathe himself, and he couldn't go home on the weekends. And 4-year-old Bobby, who drove me crazy with his incessant need for attention every moment, still needed my attention on Sunday. I just couldn't justify following the letter of the law on this one, which was Jesus' exact point in the story that we read today. The Sabbath is for healing. But what isn't fine is forgetting to stop and rest. What isn't good for us or our society as a whole is neglecting to take some time off and neglecting to give those who work for us or with us time to rest, to recreate, to do whatever it is that brings joy and sparks gratitude. So doctors can heal on Saturday or Sunday, and nurses can change bandages, and caregivers can give care every day of the week, and they too need to choose and take a day of rest. Dorothy Bass suggests that we would do well to heed the 3 millennia of Jewish reflection on the Sabbath commandment. The things that are not good Sabbath are work and commerce and worry. To refrain from working, not every day, but 1 in 7. It opens up this temporal space within which glad and grateful relationship with God and peaceful and appreciative relationships with nature and other people can grow, which is what our hearts need most. Now, I love the writings of the Jewish mystic Abraham Joshua Heschel. In his book on Sabbath, he writes, "The one who wants to enter the holiness of the day must first lay down the profanity of clattering commerce, of being yoked to toil. He must go away from the screech of dissonant days, from the nervousness and fury of acquisitiveness, and the betrayal in embezzling his own life." I like that image. Sometimes we're embezzling our own life when we don't stop and rest. Say farewell to manual work and learn to understand that the world has already been created and will survive without the help of mankind. Sadly, we now know it would survive better without the problems that mankind brings. But for 6 days a week, we wrestle with the world. We wringing profit from the earth on the Sabbath. We especially care for the seed of eternity that is planted in the soul. And I love his image of craft and art. Labor is a craft, but perfect rest is an art. It is the result of an accord of body and mind and imagination. To attain a degree of excellence in art, one must accept its discipline. The seventh day is a palace in time which we build. And truly, I think it is an art. It is difficult. I find it difficult to stop my head from thinking about what's coming on Monday or what's coming the next day. Even when my body is not at work, my mind is often there saying what's coming next. It is a discipline and it is an art to truly stop and rest and put aside all the other cares and know that God has called and invited you to do just that. To play games, to walk in nature, to do whatever brings you joy. And we come here each week, hopefully to do some of that, to rest in the presence of our Creator, to slow down and experience the calm mindfulness that often gets lost in our daily swirl of activities and our responsibilities. And again, Dorothy Bass invites us to create together a worshiping community, helping one another to step off the treadmill of working and spending, stepping into the circle of gratitude for the gifts of God. So thank God for weekends. Thank God for this tradition, for this ritual. Thank God for the commandment and the invitation and the permission, the gift of taking time to rest.